remember back a few weeks, we talked about how John Wesley kind of fell into the structure of his Methodist reform movement by accident. He began with the broad trend of his day, which was to form societies. But the smaller groups within his Methodist societies, what became classes and bands, were developed out of an economic need. The society Wesley formed in Bristol, England, grew so quickly that they built a meeting house within just a few months. The meeting house was not only a place for the society to gather, it was also the central location for their mission work, which included medical care, distributing food and clothing, and otherwise helping people get whatever they needed. In building so quickly, they needed to pay off debt. And one astute leader suggested that Wesley organize the society into classes of 12 people each, give each class its own leader from among the society's members, and make that leader responsible for collecting a penny each week from their 12 members to help pay off the debt. And if there were any in a given class who couldn't afford that penny, the class leader was charged with making up the difference. It was only as the class leaders began making the rounds to collect that penny each week that they became aware of the emotional and spiritual needs of those in their classes. And soon the class leaders, who were chosen to collect money, were also offering pastoral care to their group of 12 and then subdividing those who wanted to delve deeper into their spiritual lives into smaller bands of 5 or 6 people. The building in Bristol was paid off pretty quickly with that, but the collections continued as the needs of the poor became apparent. As I said a couple of weeks ago, the consistent and generous giving of Methodists in England made them an enormous force for good across the country, to the extent that at least one scholar credits the Wesleys and the Methodists with preventing an uprising like the French Revolution from happening in England. While Marie Antoinette was telling Les Miserables in France to eat cake, the Wesleys were telling the Methodists in England, earn all you can, save all you can, and then search out the poor and give all you can. And they did. It's important in all of this to know that the reason the division into classes helped the needs of the poor become apparent was that poverty was the condition of the majority of those in Wesley's Methodist societies. The class leaders, who were chosen in part for their ability to pay the penny for those who couldn't, learned not just about the emotional and spiritual needs of the people in their classes, they also saw how they lived, and they saw what they had, and they saw what they didn't have, and thus began to learn about the actual needs of the poor. The poverty line in England at the time was an annual income of £30 each year. As church history scholar Dr. Joshua Bohr records it, quote, the majority of Methodists were below the poverty line, with 65 to 75% earning only £20 a year. The rest of the Methodists earned just above the £30 a year rate, which meant effectively Methodism was an impoverished movement, close quote. It was those people giving a penny a week if they could, for the sake of those who had even less than they did, who collectively gave several £100 a year for over 40 years, just from the weekly donations of the classes in London. And that tracks with my own experience. Many of you know I began my ministry 30 years ago this month, also on Father's Day, in Cross City, Florida, which is a poor rural town about 50 miles due west of Gainesville. I served there from 1994 to 1997, and at the time, the per capita income in Cross City was $15,000 a year. It's actually less today if you adjust for inflation. As is my custom, I don't know what any particular individual gives to the church, but I do get more general statistics about giving patterns. At the time, the average gift to the church in Cross City was $1,500 a year, a tithe, 10% of the per capita income for the town. When I left Cross City, I went the 50 miles back east to be one of 2 associate pastors at a 3,000-member church in Gainesville. I don't know what the per capita income was in Gainesville in 1997, but I know that it was a wealthy congregation. Our members included the head coach of the Florida Gators, Steve Spurrier, who was at the time the highest paid coach in college football. He dragged the whole football team to church with him once a year. It's out on the balcony. The church was also raising money to build a new $12 million campus on land that they had just bought. In Cross City, I had visited in homes with dirt floors. Any dirt floors in the homes of the congregation in Gainesville were in their atriums. Again, apart from public information like the salary for Steve Spurrier, I had only general statistics about giving. Can you guess what the average gift was in the Gainesville congregation? It was $1,500 per year, exactly the same as Cross City. I don't think Steve was tithing. But what those 2 back-to-back experiences taught me was exactly what was evidenced in the early Methodist movement. As a percentage of income, those with the least tend to give the most. I think part of the reason is that when you're living on the edge and have a lifetime of experience making do with next to nothing, you know what it's like to go hungry and what a huge difference even a very small amount can make. I gave many gifts to help the poorest in the congregation I served in Cross City, but it never stayed with them. They gave most and sometimes all of it away to those who they believed needed it more, whether it was a monetary gift, whether it was clothing. It all went out, from our poorest to those who had less. All of the Wesleys knew what it was like to be poor. Remember that John's father, the Reverend Samuel Wesley, spent time in debtor's prison. John Wesley's subsequent insistence on limiting personal debt persists to this day in the ordination questions for United Methodist clergy. Are you in debt so as to embarrass yourself in your work? But Wesley's broader focus on the proper use of money was born during a pivotal encounter during his studies as a young man at Oxford. The core story comes from his journals, but I'm quoting here from an article titled 4 Lessons on Money by Charles Edward White, assistant professor in Christian thought and history at Spring Arbor College in Michigan and published by the Christian History Institute in 1988. Dr. White writes that John Wesley, quote, had just finished paying for some pictures for his room when one of the chambermaids came to his door. It was a cold winter day, and he noticed that she had nothing to protect her except a thin linen gown. He reached into his pocket to give her some money to buy a coat, but found he had too little left. Immediately, the thought struck him that the Lord was not pleased with the way he had spent his money. He asked himself, "Will thy master say, 'Well done, good and faithful steward'? Thou hast adorned thy walls with the money which might have screened this poor creature from the cold. O justice, O mercy, are not these pictures the blood of this poor maid?" The encounter changed Wesley's economics, and when put into practice in the Methodist movement, it changed life for England's poorest. Immediately, Wesley began to limit his expenses so that he would have more money to give to the poor. And of course, he wrote about it in his journal, which is, they're voluminous. He noted that his annual income was £30, and his basic living expenses were £28, leaving him £2 to give away, there at the poverty level of £30 a year. But John was talented and industrious, and the next year his income doubled. He continued to live on 28 pounds, but that year had 32 pounds to give away. In the third year, his income was up to 90 pounds. He lived still on 28 and gave away 62. In the fourth year, his income went up to 120 pounds. He lived on 28 and gave away 92. At some point, his basic living expenses went up to 30 pounds a year, right at the poverty level. But even when he was publishing books, his fame as a preacher had grown, and his income came in at just over 1,400 pounds a year. He lived on that 30 pounds and gave all the rest of it away. In his journal, he reports that he never had 100 pounds at any one time. In 1776, the tax commissioner couldn't believe a man of Wesley's stature owned as little as he reported on his forms. They accused Wesley of holding out some silver plate somewhere, writing to him, quote, "We cannot doubt but you have plate for which you have hitherto neglected to make an entry." Wesley wrote back, "I have 2 silver spoons at London and 2 at Bristol. This is all the plate I have at present, and I shall not buy any more while so many round me want bread." Close quote. Back in 1744, Wesley had written that when he died, quote, "If I leave behind me 10 pounds, you and all mankind may bear witness against me that I have lived and died a thief and a robber." Close quote. Across Wesley's life, he earned an estimated 30,000 pounds. When the day of his passing came in 1791, the only money mentioned in his will were the few coins to be found in his pockets and dresser drawers. Wesley didn't care about tithing, the practice of donating 10% of your income. For the very poor, that might be too much. And for the very rich, that was way too little. His mantra was earn all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. There have been many holy men and women before him and since who chose to live in intentional poverty. They would never say, earn all you can, but would instead say, earn all you need. No more, no less. Wesley saw that approach as at least a missed opportunity and could perhaps lead to sloth, which Wesley was very opposed to. Every pound he earned was that much more that could be given away to those who were not able to earn enough to make ends meet. And what great good could be done should everyone do the same? Those writing about Wesley's economics have slammed him from both sides. He's been derided as a socialist for giving everything away to the poor. He's been accused of being a godless capitalist for engaging the system to earn every last pound he could and encouraging others to do the same. Many believe that earning lots of money is merely opening the door to greed, letting the fox right into the henhouse. Even his brother Charles derided John for giving to those begging in the streets, seeing it as some kind of virtue signaling. If you give money to the poor, you will hear every one of those arguments almost verbatim today. On the flip side, it's totally cool to give Elon Musk a pay package of $56 billion, as Tesla shareholders voted to do this past week, overturning a judge's orders. He'll spend it well, right? Those people have obviously never seen a Cybertruck. But don't you dare help anyone struggling with student loans, or those crushed by medical debt, or a horror of horrors, give a kid a free lunch. Socialism! Jesus once gave a free lunch to 5,000 random people who showed up to listen to him. What a crappy fundraiser he was. He was famous. They should have paid him at least 50 denarii per plate to be with Jesus. But however you view it, there is nothing quite as clear in Wesley's writing as his belief that the use of money to care for those in need was central to Christian faith and practice. He writes in his sermon, The Use of Money, quote, "For let the world be as corrupt as it will. Is gold or silver to blame? The love of money, we know, is the root of all evil, but not the thing itself. The fault does not lie in the money, but in them that use it. It may be used ill, and what may not, but it may likewise be used well. It is full as applicable to the best as to the worst uses. In the hands of God's children, it is food for the hungry, drink for the thirsty, raiment for the naked. It gives to the traveler and the stranger where to lay his head. By it we may supply the place of a husband to the widow and of a father to the fatherless. We may be a defense for the oppressed, a means of health to the sick, of ease to them that are in pain. It may be as eyes to the blind, as feet to the lame, yea, a lifter up from the gates of death." Close quote. There was no sin in Wesley's mind of earning all you could, as long as it was earned without doing harm to yourself or others, just as long as what came in went back out again once life's necessities were covered. The start of his section on "Give all you can" in that sermon tells you everything. Quote, "But let not any man imagine that he has done anything barely by going thus far, by gaining and saving all he can, if he were to stop here. All this is nothing if a man go not forward, if he does not point all this at a farther end. Nor indeed can a man properly be said to save anything if he only lays it up. You may as well throw your money into the sea as bury it in the earth, and you may as well bury it in the earth as in your chest or in the Bank of England. Not to use is effectually to throw it away." And that whole sermon is anchored in the parable that Kim read from Luke 16, specifically from the verse about making friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, or as the King James put it, the mammon of unrighteousness. That parable, Wesley believes, is an acknowledgement that economic systems, even back in Jesus' day, were designed to serve the rich, not the poor. He acknowledges that there will be no such system in heaven. Thus, the wealth those systems produce is unrighteous or dishonest. It's not something God's going to continue on. People who are already poor shouldn't have to scrimp and save in order to give to those who aren't even able to eat or put a roof over their heads, or like his poor chambermaid at Oxford, have a coat for the winter. But some version of that system has existed for millennia. You can drag yourself to a cave and subsist as best you can, or beg for a living as a protest against the system. But Wesley saw that approach, while understandable, as a waste of a life. Those who will willingly go to those extremes because they recognize the injustice of economic systems, they would, to Wesley's minds, be the best suited people to go out and earn all they can, because they will know how to use what they gain with wisdom and justice and will not hoard wealth for themselves. As Wesley saw it, Jesus in the parable is pointing out that the ungodly know how to game the system for themselves, and that makes those ungodly people wiser than Christians who shun the system entirely rather than learn how to use that same system for the good of others. Wesley would say that if your corporate board offered you a pay package of $56 billion, you should definitely accept it. Then what? Well, the Borgen Project, a nonprofit helping those around the world who face poverty and hunger, estimates that it would take $45 billion per year until the year 2030 to eradicate world hunger. What do you say, Elon? That would leave you $11 billion per year to live on. I know it would be hard. I mean, how is anyone supposed to live on $11 billion a year? But do you think you could do it for maybe 6 years? I don't know. Sadly, in his later years, Wesley had come to believe that his movement was a failure and his life's work in vain. He saw that those impoverished Methodists who had improved the lives of so many early on had followed his instruction and greatly improved on their own ability to earn and save, but were no longer giving in equal measure. Dr. White's article notes that, quote, in the 20, 30, or 40 years since they joined the society, Many Methodists had become 20, 30, or even 100 times richer than they were at first. With this increase in wealth had come a decrease in godliness. It seemed to Wesleyanists, the more money the Methodists had, the less they loved the Lord. Wesley's system was designed to increase a person's standard of giving, not their standard of living. But it appeared that for his Methodists, things were headed in the wrong direction. He wasn't just noticing that they were backsliding on the give-all-you-can part of the equation, although they were. He saw other signs of spiritual decline. They attended services less, they lost their zeal for spreading the gospel, and seemed far less interested in the process of sanctification. They were less willing to visit the sick. They were developing an overweening pride that made them less willing to accept correction. You once pushed on through cold or rain or whatever cross lay in your way to see the poor, the sick, the distressed, he reminded them. Do you fear spoiling your silken coat? Are you afraid of catching vermin? All those signs of decline he blamed on the love of money. In his sermon on the danger of increasing riches, Wesley writes, "Do not you know that God entrusted you with that money, all above what buys necessities for your family, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to help the stranger, the widow, the fatherless, and indeed, as far as it will go, to relieve the wants of all mankind? How dare you defraud your Lord by applying it to any other purpose?" Close quote. While the Methodists over time began to do less good in the world than they otherwise might have, John Wesley kept his own strict financial practices from that encounter with the Oxford chambermaid to the end of his long life. And as he grew wealthy, that was no small thing. But neither did he give up preaching to his societies about the proper use of money, or spend all his time mingling with the poor. Especially as he became a prominent figure in London, he mingled also with the rich and powerful, collecting money for orphanages, schools, women's work cooperatives, homes for widows, medical facilities, and special banks for the poor with a special loan fund for them that he set up. He was known to collect over £200 in just 1 week from speaking to the wealthy as he walked the streets of London. In 1791, Wesley died at age 87. The illness that took his life was pneumonia, which he contracted by walking through the cold, slushy streets of London in winter, wearing boots with holes in them, to personally bring food to the poor. He might have lived even longer had he followed his own advice and spent some of his vast income on new boots, which he obviously needed. But disheartened by the decline in giving from his Methodists, perhaps he no longer cared for anything other than ensuring that the hungry were fed. Wesley's critics might have been right in believing that the earn all you can, save all you can part of Methodist teaching wouldn't hold up. That Methodists, like other Christians, would forget our role as stewards, begin to think that whatever wealth comes our way, whether through our own toil or through gift or inheritance, is somehow ours rather than God's. Perhaps that was all totally predictable. Wesley preached many, many sermons on money and its use. That's biblical preaching. In the Gospels, Jesus talks about money and possessions more than anything else except the kingdom of God. To pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven, without dealing with the chief obstacle to that happening, is to pray the Lord's Prayer in vain. The middle piece of his system, the save all you can part, is where it came unglued. He had been clear that the specifics of what a person needed to prevent damage to their own body, mind, and soul, which he insisted on, was a judgment call and was unique to each person. He couldn't stand there and say, no, you only need X to live on because you're a unique person and what is harmful to your soul may not someone else, and likewise with your own bodies. He gave a lot of leniency there. But that nuance made it easy to justify ever greater expenses, even often without knowing that you're doing it, just as we keep up with the Joneses, and when the Joneses change, and all of a sudden the Joneses make more or have a higher standard, then all of a sudden, we're thinking we're more impoverished than we are, and we often don't know we're doing it. Knowing that many honestly struggled with whether an expense would be justified in God's eyes, Wesley offered his Methodists a prayer. If they could say this prayer and still feel good about the expense, then go ahead, spend it. And so it is for us. Money in and of itself is simply a tool, and is only as righteous or unrighteous as the uses to which it's put. You can spend it to feed the hungry of the world, or to build rockets to send people to Mars. Let Wesley's prayer guide you as you try to decide. Lord, you see I'm going to expend this sum for this purpose, and you know I act therein with a single eye, as a steward of your goods, expending this portion of them thus in pursuance of the design you had in entrusting me with them. You know I do this in obedience to your word, as you command, and because you command it. Let this, I implore you, be a holy sacrifice, acceptable through Jesus Christ. And give me a witness in myself that for this labor of love I shall have a recompense when you reward each person according to their works. Amen.
Amen.